It's legit. There's a countdown. We're live. Hey, Nick.
Hey.
What's up, Nick?
So I've been really excited to have this conversation. You and I met, I think it was early 2016, if I'm not mistaken, when I joined Breeze. And you were one of the lead engineers on a very small pod, of which I was the final ingredient, I guess, as the first PM at Breeze. And we moved out of headquarters and basically shacked up in an apartment in San Francisco for, I don't know, 4 or 5 months and built what ended up becoming the most valuable piece of software that we had that led to an acquisition by Ford. And then we stayed 2 years post-acquisition together as we built Canvas. I don't think it's a stretch to say you're the engineer I've spent the longest amount of time working with continuously.
Fantastic.
It's been really nice to have a chance now to reconnect and to have a fun conversation.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to save some time for stories. I think the ingredients of 2 years together and a small apartment in San Francisco probably is a fertile ground for some fun Ben stories.
But yeah, by the ballpark.
Yeah.
Which actually, one of my former coworkers, who's now co-founder of Pylon, they were in a condo right by the ballpark, and every time I would chat with him, I was always reminiscing of just hanging out, working in an apartment, which those are good old days. Almost.
Yeah, we literally so the original Breeze office, where the mainland headquarters was in I think it was the basement or the lobby of the Zynga building in San Francisco. For those who know where that building is, and at some point the leadership team made the decision that for this new 0 to 1 initiative to have a chance, we truly needed to sever day-to-day connections from mainland. So there was a day where we literally took our chairs and we wheeled them all the way. I think 20 minutes down along the Caltrain tracks to this apartment in Soma, and we wheeled a whiteboard and desks and stuff. And anyways, that was a crazy period, lots and lots of fun. And yeah, I'd say the apartment was only about 4 months, if I'm not mistaken, but then we probably worked out of 4 or 5 different office spaces together over the course of 3 years. But anyways, Nick, it's great to be catching up. So the world is very different now than what it looked like when we were building Karmada and building Breeze and building Canvas back in 2016 through, let's call it 2018, I think early 2019 to join Abstract. And back then, if we needed to build a page, we needed to build a website, we needed to make a copy change in code, anything, it all had to go through Jira and get ticketed. Engineers had to work on it. And here we are in 2025, and I could vibe code websites, I could get the repo loaded in Cursor and ship updates. I can do so many things without being an engineer. And there's a narrative that's crafting that we should just be building way more stuff because AI is allowing teams to just get so much more done. And we have yet to have an engineer on the podcast to talk about what do engineers think about all this. So that's why we're really excited to talk to you. So I guess where I want to start the conversation is how has your life changed as an engineer over the last couple of years with a lot of these AI tools becoming more increasingly prevalent?
I think it's changed a considerable amount, but has sort of dipped and dived a lot. And my first introduction to using some sort of LLM tool was actually just copy pasting stuff into ChatGPT, and I think it was mid last year, because during that time ChatGPT was good-ish, but a lot of the times the stuff that would come out of it wasn't too good. And then at the end of last year, 2024, Claude came out, and that was definitely a level up. But for a long time, GitHub's Copilot was just bad. It was not helpful, so I always steer clear of it. So just a lot of copy paste. And when I was on paternity leave at the end of last year, I started working with Cursor, and that was that next level up of, oh my gosh, I can just do everything in an IDE. And when I came back from paternity leave, I pushed a lot of people at Entra to start using Cursor and asking hey, do we have budget for this? Can we start implementing a lot of these tools? And I think the slope was going up towards just get an LLM to code everything for you. And how do we write really good Jira tickets so that we can just use like a Jira MCP to say, oh, go grab that ticket and implement this thing. Or if we want to use a lot of like planning mode and like switching over to Claude Code as well, like using planning mode or ask mode in Cursor to do a lot of planning and create a bunch of docs. And so essentially like you're starting to do a lot of like pseudocoding, which for a lot of like new engineers, we hear about pseudocoding. You're doing a lot of pseudocoding, right? So you're producing all this context to then give to.
How do you define pseudocoding, by the way? How is that different than vibe coding?
Pseudocoding, I think it's like now probably the same, but before it would just be like you would write comments in your code. Step 1, I need this thing to do this. Step 2, I need this thing to do this. And then when you can replace those code comments with the actual code that you're writing. And so I think it's now very much the same thing. But then when it comes to the work that we do, we can create all this context and then like press go. And like it does all this work, right? Like especially if you let like Claude Code do its thing, or if you let Cursor's agent just go wild and just say, these are all the things I accept and you can just do anything. The end result could be really good, or the end result could just be like, it's gone off for 10 minutes and the code it's produced is incomprehensible. And so and I've also been following the conversation online about coding agents. And I think, at least my experience and the experience I've been seeing,
the coding agent, like a definition of a coding agent might be like Cloud Code
like Devin,
or like Cursor or Codex.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, like any kind of like AI coding tool. Or the pendulum is swung so far to saying, hey, can we get these coding agents to do everything for us? Back into a middle of maybe we don't want to do everything with the coding agent, not only because is it maybe in some points like insecure, but also like maybe we spend more time doing a lot more code reviews and even like being that level of abstraction from the code, you understand it a little bit less than like actually writing it yourself. So I find a lot of engineers are finding the pieces where AI coding tools are more helpful, and then doing some things more like still manually and using and leveraging AI coding tools in different ways.
Yeah, I think where my head is going that I would love to understand a little bit more deeply is from the time, let's say like mid last year, that you started using ChatGPT as a thought partner and or like a smart friend you can ask questions, to now, right, where you're using, it sounds like Cursor with a bunch of MCPs, and maybe you're trusting it to actually generate code. I'm curious, like, if maybe we can divide it into almost like stages of what it was like to work with AI as a friend or co-pilot or agent. And maybe what were you doing versus what was the AI doing, and how you were splitting responsibilities, and maybe like some of the learnings there, and then walk all the way to today and how you're using it, and maybe like your thoughts of like maybe where things are going next.
Sure. Yeah. So I think starting was definitely a lot of copy pasting problems. Like I have this stack trace. What's happening? Or almost like replacing Stack Overflow. Because I think prior to ChatGPT, and now we see Stack Overflow is trying to pivot in lots of different ways, where they gave away all this amazing content for free, which then, of course, like every single LLM can train on all this data that they had available publicly. And so initially starting by replacing Stack Overflow for like a lot of stack traces, or saying a lot of copy pasting of, this is my file, here's an example spec file, write a spec file for me, and then be able to like copy paste that in. And then even in that, then you have to look at it, still kind of review it yourself, and then still make sure it runs. And then I think at that point in time too, I wasn't thinking too much about getting like LMs to do any other kind of work for me. I think it's more so just like stay on the task of coding. And then moving into having an IDE like Cursor, it was that first spark of magic.
Yeah, maybe. Well, before jumping into Cursor, you
Sure.
also mentioned Claude. Did anything change with Claude, or was it just like a better, almost like ChatGPT, or was there any like step function change there?
Oh yeah.
Um,
I think probably the step function change was having like a desktop app. And for a lot of engineers, like hotkeys are like how we love to live. And so instead of having to find a browser tab where I have this conversation, I can just like command tab to Claude and then be able to say, these are the things I need to do, command tab back, command tab in, command tab back. And so I think that was probably like the step function, is just like integrating it a little bit closer to how it's working. Yeah, thanks for calling that out, Mark.
yeah.
Um, and then yeah, moving on to
So you said
Cursor.
Cursor
Oh,
got into magic.
yeah,
That like
Cursor was kind of like magic because
what was your magic moment? Do you remember it? Was there like a aha moment there? Oh wow, this is different.
yeah, I was building a side project and I was like, oh, I need to implement this dashboard that uses Tailwind with the correct like tile sizes and make it work for multiple devices. I do a lot of backend engineering at Entra, and so like I can work on the front end. We have a great design system at Entra, but like a lot of the like front end like work that I would do is like very medial for the most part. And so when I need to build this dashboard, is like this mountain I felt like I had to climb, because I was like, oh wait, how do I do like sizing again? Like, what is the specific way that Tailwind says this is how you size a box? This is how you like make it smaller, larger, etc., based on screen size. And I just said, can you create a dashboard that has these tiles in it and make sure that it can be resized easily? And it did it. I was like, wow, okay. And then working through some kind of like pricing shenanigans on being able to like display pricing with like sliders or like a toggle switch. That's all stuff that is almost felt like toil that I'd need to figure out, that I could just say, I want to do it like this. And Cursor writes all the code. I reload my local and say, oh, actually, I like this a little bit more. Can you make it like this? And I was able to just like iterate on those pieces much faster. So I think that's probably very much in line with how people feel like Lovable and Bolt and V0 is almost like magic, because you can tell it to do this thing and it does it automatically. And I think definitely from an engineering perspective, it's then picking what are the things you care about and what are the things you don't care about. So like some of that front endy stuff, if it works and it looks good, probably enough. Some of the more back end, like business logic stuff, that's probably stuff like I care more to touch and be more in the weeds on. And when it comes to, oh, sorry.
I was going to ask, have you had, and not to jump the gun if this is where we're going per Mark's last question, but have you had yet that exact like aha moment or that magic moment on the back end coding side of things where you've made the leap from I don't quite trust vibe coding back end business logic to like actually think this works, like this is competitive with how I would do it?
I think as yes, but not from a coding perspective. I think as like a thought partnership perspective and from a debugging perspective. So when it comes to thought partnership, it's knowing certain like patterns and data structures and being able to say, yeah, I'm thinking of this kind of architecture. What are like a few different ways that this could be built? And having Claude Code in planning mode, or having Cursor, or even like using Claude desktop itself, like work through a problem with me. And I think this is like similar to a lot of like other use cases that people have. I know, like, Ben, you've talked about this in the past of being able to have ChatGPT in voice mode as like a thought partner to like talk through problems, or even recently like working through some of your
the Copilot jailbreak stuff.
Yeah, like just talking through different implementation options, I think is really helpful, because then that helps brainstorm and create this world of possibilities, and then be able to understand, ooh, that doesn't really make sense. I like that piece of this part of the architecture. Can we pair that with this part? And so you're like moving all these different puzzle pieces together, and you actually get something that was thought up and generated by AI, but your fingerprints are absolutely all over it because you've had to work through all of these steps with the tool. And then on the debugging side, it's been really helpful to be able to say, we're having, for example, like we have this performance problem. We have this really gnarly N+1 that's happening. For people who don't know what N+1s are, it's when you do additional work when iterating through a collection. So this is typical if you're saying, I want to fetch this collection of records, and for each record, go look up all these other things. And so that creates performance problems, because you could have maybe 6 different database calls that you're making for each iteration of a loop. And if you're looping over maybe, let's say, 100 items, now you're making like 600 database requests versus preloading all those things and trying to get rid of those things. And so, finding like really gnarly problems like that, and then being able to say, what might be happening? I think like it's in this area. And this is especially helpful with legacy code bases, or like areas that you haven't touched of like really large code bases, and just like identify like hotspots. And something that I did recently was using Claude Code and ChatGPT 5 or GPT-5 in Cursor, and asking both to analyze the problem. They actually came up with different solutions, and have them like rate each other's solution. And then Claude actually said the other one's right, and GPT-5 wasn't very nice about Claude's suggestion for like how to fix this. So then, like, rather than spending like hours potentially debugging and like tracing code to be able to even just like find a hint of what might be happening, that can happen very fast. And now it makes like tracing the code much easier, because there's like a through line that has a more likely scenario that we have. And so I think those two pieces were like, wow, I can't believe like I created this kind of architecture by having this LLM teammate, and I debugged this thing faster than I thought I would. I thought it would take me like a day and a half to debug, and I debugged it in 20 minutes, and I had a spike PR up in 15 or 20 minutes. So going from like a day and a half to like less than an hour's worth of work is pretty incredible. Even though that code isn't like production ready, it's this like, hey, this is probably how we might want to solve this as a spike kind of thing. Was mind-blowing.
Yeah, so cool. I do think that people are sleeping on Codex from OpenAI, especially when you use GPT-5 on high or medium. Like I've been also doing similar bake-offs between Cloud Code and Codex, and they're catching up fast. And even their Cursor plugin is, I feel like, so much. I mean, I think for engineers are probably gonna be like, dude, like terminal interfaces are amazing, but for someone who's not an engineer, I do the new interface of Codex. So a little bit side tangent there, but so it sounds maybe to like recap on these like kind of like backend conversation of like how you're using Cursor or any of these coding agents. It sounds like basically use it for the almost like the architecture drafting and designing as like a third partner, and then when things break as a debugging. But it sounds like, for example, once you have the architecture and you still do all the work yourself, right? Like the scaffolding of the architecture, running the actual code, and all that stuff is still being done by Nick, the human. Or is there, or are you doing some scaffolding and like setting some of the structure, and then you're letting some of these agents generate code? Like, how is that happening at all? Or, and if not, why not?
I think it has Yeah, definitely changed. Initially, it was very much like, how do I just give a AI tool like all the context to try and figure it out itself, and then that resulted in a lot of code review, unborking things, and trying to get to run. And now I've started to settle on being able to like drive some like general direction of where I want to go, and then help it actually step through and say, okay, now that we've done this thing, build this class that I need that has like this functionality, make sure it looks good, and then do any kind of like tweaks that I want to do on it, and then move on to the next step, where it's like a little bit more of a back and forth versus actually like letting it do everything and then me also like going in and doing everything. I think depending on what it comes up with,
They're kind of looking over
sometimes,
its shoulder in very like incremental scoped kind of requests, and then each time it gets a task done, then you're like, cool, now let's move on to this task. But you're almost doing like local code reviews after each step to be like, do I think this implementation made sense? Like it's almost like a junior developer whose shoulder you're looking over at every step of the way, who's
yeah,
just moving at superhuman speed.
Yeah,
yeah.
Nick is basically micromanaging the intern.
That is, I moved up management because I was micromanaging too much. No, I'm kidding. But now I get to do it every single day. But then also like that's definitely true. One other slight thing to mention though too is like I still do some coding if like it gets it totally wrong. I just say, okay, it's a lot faster for me to do this myself and write it out. And especially with some of the autocomplete, I think Cursor's autocomplete has gotten better. It makes it a lot easier to say it knew what I was roughly trying to do, and I started to give it a pattern as I'm like writing this file, and it can autocomplete a lot of it. So I think definitely still calling out there is places for engineers to still write the code. And if like you find that's like part of your process, I think that's definitely what people should be doing. But yeah, for me,
I,
it's step by step.
I have a follow up. I'm curious, Mark, what you're going to ask, but just like a quick follow up and then go with your question. I'm sure you haven't quantified it, Nick, so don't feel the need to be like precise, but just like ballpark, and feel free to also touch on like how this might compare to your other friends who are engineers. But for you personally, like the amount of a 40-hour, like the percentage of a 40-hour work week that you spend coding, what do you think it was 2 years ago, like literally writing code versus today, like yourself?
I think that is very hard to quantify. I'd probably say it's probably easier to do like a percent difference. I'd probably say I write like actually writing the code out 50% less, I would say. Because I think when it comes to the work that we do as engineers, like some of it is spent meetings, some of it is spent diagramming, some of it is like pairing, all those kinds of things. And so I think it's like hard for my brain to like wrap around like how much time did I spend coding? But I know I
That's
definitely
still
code
50%,
less.
50% less. What I'm hearing is whatever the baseline was, you're finding yourself now coding roughly, spending roughly 50% of that time these days writing code to yourself. And do you feel like relative to your peers, friends, like other engineers you respect, are you hearing similar kinds of orders of magnitude of change?
I think it's all dependent on how like whether people are like early adopters or laggards. I think for some people they're very much on the like I want to write all the code myself because it's also like a creative pursuit. I think being an engineer is, even though there's like science and math involved, you have this canvas that you can build anything with. And so you have to be very creative in like the different types of patterns or conventions that you want to use. You have to be able to fit the right tools into the right spaces and things like that. And so I think some people just like love doing that and they just want it to be part of their art. And some people are very much on the I will try to get Claude or Cursor to write all the code for me, which we actually have a couple engineers on our team at Entra that have been like really leading that to see just like how far they can push it. And some of their outputs are very impressive. And I definitely look up to them to see what are the new ways that we can be thinking about these tools and what are the different things that I want to try next to see if it like fits into my workflow or not. And so I think it's very variable. I don't think I could, describe exactly.
I think the interesting question to me is, okay, cool. Like, it sounds like you're writing 50% less code yourself. But what would you say is, like, how is that translated to like impact? Is it you're writing less code but having the same impact? You're writing less code and having more impact? Like how do you think about that?
This is your 6-month performance review conversation, Nick. How's your impact going these days, Nick?
I think it's variable, to be honest. I think for some things, I'm able to get probably the same amount of work done in 90% less time. For example, we implemented a feature for our one of the products at Entra is AI summarization, and we have like different data types that we can have for answers of pulling data out of contracts. And one of the data types that we need to support was currencies. And so that was a lot of working through what are all the shenanigans we need to do to be able to make sure like currencies are supported, etc. And there was this like piece of functionality that how our currencies works is like we have the currency amount and like the unit itself. And then one of our other data types is like a date delta. It's like a time interval to say this is the amount and this is the interval. Is it months? Is it weeks? Is it years, etc. For like a term of contract, for example. And the implementation to be able to say, I want to do exactly what I did for currency with date delta was, hey, look at this file that I implemented for currency. This is a date delta. Write the code, write the front end specs, write the back end specs, which is like our end-to-end integration specs, and throw up a PR. And it did it like instantaneously. It was perfect. All specs passed, everything worked. It went through QA, like completely green. And I think that was probably like the fastest things I've ever shipped. It took me like 10 minutes. And in
the old days, that would have been
half a day, at least, maybe a day, right? You have to do all the things like, oh, what if there's some weird like linting errors you have to worry about? And so
half a day can turn into a day or a day and a half easily if you just go down any rabbit holes, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
those 5-point tasks, man. They can be a day or they can be a week.
And so I think that's when my impact is so fast, right? Especially if you know exactly what you need to be doing, or even if you have a really well-defined like project with all these tickets, say do that. Like you're just like slamming things out. But if it's like a little bit more like discovery oriented or needing to do any kind of like factoring, now in some ways like AI gets in the way because you might want to rely on it, but since there's so much context that goes into a massive code base, everything coming out is garbled. And now that task is like actually going like much, much slower because you have to go back and like fact check work. And it would have been faster just to do it yourself. And so I think my impact is much faster because I've learned the lesson of don't let AI do everything. But I almost can't remember what life was like before, which is this is the first time I'm realizing this. It's a very scary feeling to not know what life was like before coding agents.
I don't know if we want to get into a very scary territory, but while we're at it, I think there's two kind of questions that I'm just curious how like all these different functions that work in tech are thinking about. And one is like what are your thoughts around like your job security for the next like 5 to 10 years, given of what you experienced and how technology is evolving, one of them. And then the other one is like how are you thinking about like, what are some things that are very important that you bring to the table you think are not going to be replaced? And there's a third one almost of, for example, I think like a lot of people, like for example, like engineers got into engineering because they enjoyed the process of writing code. And now that AI is changing their role a little bit, like How do you have to feel like you have to rediscover like what brings satisfaction in your role because your role is changing so quickly? Anyways, I just threw 3 big questions at you, but it's just like
Those
those
are
are 3
easy.
questions.
3 quick
Yeah.
ones.
I actually wrote that down because something about me is I'll try and remember all of them, but I'll be thinking about the first one and the rest of them will just go in my brain. So I definitely wrote them down. So I think job security, initially, I was freaked out for a long time. A long time. And I think that's because we're in a hype cycle. And everywhere you look, AI is going to kill this job, AI is going to kill this job. Like, seeing how well all these different models do against coding benchmarks, you're like, oh my gosh. Like, you hear stories about CEOs laying off like entire engineering departments because you're like, oh, we can just vibe code this. This is easy. It's totally fine. And so if you get into that and you like buy into it, it's almost like you're doom scrolling your life, right? And it gets very scary. And I think how I combated that is by actually using the tools. And for a while, I was just on Cursor and I heard Claude Code and Claude Code. I was like, oh my gosh, this Claude Code can be the thing that like kills my work or kills my job. But then I started using Claude Code. I'm like, oh yeah, it's an improvement, but it doesn't do everything. And I think so when it comes to job security, I think touching the tools is how you like back up from that like spiral that I know I definitely felt. But then also understanding that there are tons of things that a coding agent cannot do. And things like getting alignment internally on a team or being able to translate like product requirements into the future into technical strategy or thinking about what are all of the different lessons you've learned from different companies that you can apply to your current problem set. And so I think, for example, a lot of coding agents are trained on the corpus of open source code, but a lot of the big stuff is all proprietary, right? Like you're never going to know the internals of Dropbox's code. The only way you understand how Dropbox works is because you worked at Dropbox and they have like different patterns and conventions that you can bring to like your next role. And so I think things like that help me feel like my job is more secure. And then also we hear a lot about vibe coding and security incidents with like vibe coded products and things like that. And so making sure like humans are touching the code, I think will always be necessary. I think what we then need to think about as like engineers is how does our job evolve such that we are using this tool. And I think it's like maybe a cliche thing to say that like AI is not going to isn't going to come for your job. It's like another person that knows how to use AI will come for your job, because I think it helps you level up in so many different ways that if you're not using this tool, now you're like less relevant, because that's also going to be a skill set that a lot of companies are going to be evaluating, right? Because if we think about using LLMs in products, we want to make sure we have engineers that can build AI products. We want to make sure that we have engineers that can understand how do you get this tool to label things accurately. Can you get this? Can you run evals against this tool? Are you running code evals? Are you running LLM as judge evals? There's a lot of skills that go into using AI and having AI as part of your skill set that like you need to be able to have, that if you shy away from using it, you're going to be like less relevant to how products are being built into the future.
If you're enjoying this conversation, please check out the links in the show notes to support the podcast. Marc and I do this out of love, but to keep it going, we also need your support. Thanks, and now back to the episode. Yeah, it's almost there's this like spectrum where on one end of the spectrum, there's the person who doesn't want to use AI tools to do anything. And I think the future for those people I don't think looks very bright, because I don't know how much demand there will be and how much the market will tolerate the behavior and the performance and the impact of those engineers. But then let me just finish this thought for a second.
I'm curious on that. Actually, on that point.
Yeah.
Let's say like you have the best engineer right at a company, right? Like my understanding is that that person can still get away not using any coding agent almost, because like the level of abstraction that they're able to operate and how good they are, like it almost it trumps any coding agent. And
the exception to that though might be if there's like a cultural push, like there's a company-wide push that people need to start using AI to do their job. Like I forget which company was it Shopify? I just read an article I think last week about there was a company-wide mandate that like everyone has a week to start using AI, and if in a week from now you're not able to prove that you've been using AI in any way to do your job, you're basically fired. And some people were on PTO, some people were on pat leave, they were excused, but people that were not, and they just didn't have an excuse, they just didn't do it, they were like let go. And so you could argue with whether that makes sense or not, but I do think that from a real job, like some people have lost their jobs because they've just refused to adopt. Now, is the company going to kick themselves and rehire those people because they realized that was a dumb policy? That was like maybe, we'll find out. But I think the reason for the policy is the more interesting thing, which is there's a belief, and maybe it's a dogmatic belief that will turn out to be not true factually, but there does seem to be a prevailing notion that engineers who are laggards to the tool are less valuable to companies than engineers that are forward-leaning and exploring the edges of the tools. And where I was going with the spectrum thing, because I don't think it's black and white. So like there's the laggard on this end that doesn't use the tools at all. And we can debate what we just talked about for the last 30 seconds. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's the engineer who's using the tool to do everything, using AI to do everything, right? And I think that the verdict, like, I suspect we're going to realize that's also not, like, no one wants that engineer either, because it's like, why didn't you, like, the things that Nick, you were saying earlier about human judgment and past experience and wisdom and all the system design stuff. So it's almost like the Goldilocks of what we want is someone who's tinkering. Like we want an engineer who tinkers with AI, understands what the tools are good at, understands what the tools are not good at, uses human judgment and human coding where it's fastest and most efficient and most effective, and uses AI where that's the fastest and most effective. So it's almost like there's this layer of discernment and judging that will maybe become a very prized attribute of not just maybe we're talking about engineering now, but probably many different jobs. Do you guys agree? Like that's where I'm landing so far in the conversation on. There's not black and white, and it's like the judgment is so critical. But you can't have the judgment if you're not tinkering with the tools, because you don't know what you don't know. If you've never played with a code gen agent, you're the laggard engineer. How can you have the judgment to know whether it's faster to do something just as well, like 100% as good, and half the time with AI? Like you don't have the judgment.
I agree. Yeah, it's almost like there's like two dimensions that you have to think on. One is I think you have to build like that intuition for what is these tools are really good at and where they fall short. And I think a lot of times they're almost counterintuitive because they're just like operated very differently than we do in a way. And then the other dimension is almost like I like to think of like the Shreyas Doshi like LNO framework of there's like the leverage tasks that basically they're super high priority, like you do them well will have an outsized impact, and the ones that are like they're important, so they're like neutral, you have to get them done, you shouldn't spend too much time on them, you should just get them done and get them done like at a solid level. And then there's, I forgot what DO stands for.
Is it overhead?
Overhead, yeah, which is basically you actually want to do them like quickly and not that good because you want to avoid people giving you more of those almost. And I think
it might not be overhead. I don't know. I just
something
like, negative.
Yeah, something negative. Basically, they're not like based on like low leverage activities, basically. And the way I think about it is you probably don't really want to delegate anything in L at all. Like I think you might want to use something as like a kind of like thinking partner, but you still want to be the driver and almost think very critically and get in touch with those source materials. And I think for product, that's probably talking to customers, right? Really going deep into interviews. For engineering, it sounds like that's probably like architecture, right? And like the scaffolding and on all those things that are actually pretty important that have like outside impacts. And I think really where the true leverage comes for me, I think it's like, of course, like the O, but those don't matter that much. But like the neutral, all of a sudden, the output that you can have with neutral goes a lot bigger, and then you can do way more of it, which then they're still important, but not super high leverage. And then counterintuitive parts, you spend less time doing them too. So then you all of a sudden also have more time to do those high leverage tasks that are really important and really move the needle. So I think that's how I think about it in a way.
Yeah. I Googled, it is overhead.
Nice.
But yeah, no, that makes sense. I forget, Mark, are we still on your first question, or how
I think we're still on
we're
first
on the
question.
first question,
Job
yeah. Okay.
security. Yeah.
I think we covered it. What was the second question?
What do I bring to the table, I think? Or is that like as a senior engineer, or what's the...
Yeah, almost like, how do you see, like, what are the most important skills you think are going to become more and more important over time? And how do you think right now about developing them, basically?
I think, and this is probably skills for everyone, and especially for junior engineers, because it's so easy to offload a lot of your thinking and offload a lot of stuff to AI tools. And junior engineers are amazing because they just want to make an impact, and they'll work so hard to make that happen. And they're very early adopters of things. But then downside, if you're using a lot of these tools, is then you just offload a lot of things and you say, oh, like that sounds right. So let's just go in that direction when NLM doesn't know. And so like you do have to build the scar tissue and like have all the battle scars to figure out and learn. But a skill that I think is definitely teachable that everyone will need is just critical thinking. And this comes in the form of things like, of course, does this code make sense? Is this achieving what it needs to achieve? But then even to, is this the right thing that we should be building? Or in terms of like team dynamics, what are next steps? I've found like a lot of teams even struggle with talking about, so what's next? Who's working on what pieces of this project go together based on today's stand-up?
You were always very good at that part. I'll say you
Thank
were
you.
always like the guy that I think was sniffing out areas where there wasn't really clarity on who does what, and getting people into a room and figuring out who's going. I think that's such an incredibly valuable skill that has nothing to do with code.
Completely agree.
But you can't really do that well unless you understand like the structure of the code base, and you understand what has to happen and what, not the Gantt chart visually, but like the mental Gantt chart of what blocks what and what needs to happen when. That's a critically important skill set that I doubt AI is in a position to do, because oftentimes when I think back to a lot of those whiteboards, Nick, a lot of the pieces on the whiteboard didn't exist yet. We were basically moving pieces on the board we were playing like a temporal game of chess. Like, this is what the next month is going to look like, and that's going to be incremental on what exists today. But then bam, here's 3 new pieces that don't exist yet. And now how do those pieces play together?
I think like 100% that is where like all engineers need to be focusing on is, at the end of the day, like every single role, even like product design, engineering, you're just a problem solver. And especially with AI, I think we're seeing those roles compress a lot, because now there are tools like Figma MCP or using things like Subframe, where you can just vibe design this thing, export to code, and I don't need to be a designer, but I need to like have some sort of idea of taste, because at the end of the day, I just need to solve a problem. And so that problem solving, that critical thinking is just like a whole skill set that if people keep that top of mind, that I think helps them like develop those muscles. And one thing, because I think it's like very easy to say like, oh, just like practice critical thinking. And to be really clear, I think critical thinking is like really hard, and practicing is really hard. Like you actually have to take time of your day and be like, how am I going to do this? And you have to use a lot of creativity and sectioning out hours in the day or minutes in a day to actually think about problems, actually think of, okay, oh, what is the next step for this project? Who do I need to talk to let them know that like our timeline is slipping? How do I need to communicate that stuff? Like, we think about critical thinking as, oh, we just think of it and it happens, but it's something you actually have to spend time grappling with. And I find a lot of people don't spend enough time thinking. And I can't remember if it's like Marc Benioff or who's the CEO of LinkedIn?
Ryan something.
Oh, I can't
Polanski?
remember. Someone.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
He, I think, is like famous for like blocking off like half of his day every day, or like half of his day like one day a week, or whole day one day a week, just think. And I think that's like an under-leveraged skill that whatever time like maybe you're making up for that AI can help you be faster at, take an extra hour to think. An hour a week, an hour 2 days a week. It's incredible how much reflection time helps you get past that next hurdle of like maybe that thing you're grappling with.
And one of my favorite things is when I do block those times, and I find that going for a walk, or Marc knows lately I've been doing some ChatGPT voice mode sessions while shooting hoops. But like,
that's amazing, by the way.
But
by the way, how does that work? Do you have the AirPods on and you're shooting hoops?
I have the AirPods on. So, side note, I have some friends that have been in Europe for 2 months, and they gave me keys to water their plants. But they have a basketball building. They have a basketball court in their building, and so I can go down there, and there's really good Wi-Fi. So I can, and there's like a place to put my laptop, and there's like never anyone there. So I can shoot hoops. I put on my AirPods, and I can like. Marc, yesterday we were talking about something important, and in getting ready for that conversation, I had a solid 15-minute conversation probably with ChatGPT where I just like dumped context, and it helped me figure out how like in the process of having to verbalize it, especially while I'm moving. I'm like a moving thinker. That's why I always used to do walking one-on-ones. Like I think it's better, helps me with my brain. But the act of thinking is no longer something that I imagine as like a static activity where I'm sitting sedentary somewhere and like writing or whatever. It's like an active motion, and there's like a thought partner that remembers everything I say, and then it can actually help me synthesize. And one of my instructions to ChatGPT has been to pressure test my thinking and to be like a skeptical kind of, not, I don't use the term devil's advocate, but poke holes in my thinking, or I'll try to always present like another perspective on how what I'm saying is like wrong. And regardless of the content of exactly what it says, the fact of hearing like the map that it lays out for like various things that could be said based on what it's hearing from me, I'm like, okay, here's this other really important piece of context I haven't shared with you. And then I do that until I'm like, okay, there's actually no more context I feel is relevant to this that I've not expressed. And I'm trying to think of what do I actually care about based on everything I just said to you? What are the various things I might care about? And then which questions would you maybe ask me to help me figure out what matters to me the most? And in the process of doing that, I get to the point where like inevitably I'm like, man, I got to write this down, because I get some clarity about how I actually feel about something and what matters to me. And so I couldn't agree with you more, Nick, but I don't think there's a dichotomy or a conflict between using AI and carving out time to think. I actually think there's a really nice way to use AI to think, in addition to using AI to do a bunch of other stuff like drafting content or whatever.
Yeah, but it sounds like almost like it can help you think, and it can be like it's almost like therapy in a way, right? It's asking you the questions, but you need to do the processing, right?
And you need to frame things. You know, like if you go into a therapy session, one of the first things that you'll find out is if you say something that makes no sense, the therapist will ask you like clarifying questions, like, can you help me understand what that means? Or at least if they're a good therapist. And in the process of having to explain something to ChatGPT, which is like a free business coach or a free therapist, however you want to use it, if I'm literally struggling to frame the question, I'm like, what the fuck? I thought I knew what I was trying to think through with this, but I can't even open up the conversation because like I'm confused about what I'm even trying to talk about. And even that can be clarifying, because the moment that you recognize that you're not clear on what you even need to think about, what are the decisions I need to make, what are the questions I need to be asking or answering, that in its own I find to be incredibly helpful. And honestly, it reduces anxiety and stress like so much. It's super therapeutic to figure out what you're actually thinking about.
Yeah. And I think thinking about the best engineers that I work with, and I'm thinking like what made them really good. I think that critical thinking, I think it was like a very common theme. And I think the way it manifests itself is like, it actually manifests itself in a lot of different ways, right? One is, I love when an engineer pushes back on an idea or even asks me the hard questions. Do we actually need this? I think that's awesome. I think the other one that I really love when engineers like just proactiveness, be like, hey, like I heard this. I think there's just like a low risk thing. I went and got it done. That's awesome too. I think that really good engineers tend to have really good social capital. And I think the way that it's beneficial for the team and the product in general is like they know really quickly who to talk to for what. And what that means is that allows them to move a lot faster because they can get to the answer a lot quicker. And then the other one is like that they're able, I think that's what you were getting at, Ben, too, is like they're able to think at a level higher of abstraction and strategic of sequencing and like really being able to predict roadblocks or challenges. So then we solve them before we hit them. And that can save a lot of times it's like months of work or even weeks, which is super valuable. And it sounds like that's not going anywhere yet.
Agreed. What was the third question?
Yeah. I'm curious what you wrote down, but
I wrote down, do we have to rediscover like things that like bring us joy? I think what we enjoy about our work.
Yeah, it was more okay. Like, I think my assumption is like people get into engineering because one, they love taking ideas and turning them into reality in the world. I think that's maybe like the more aspirational one, but also I think they enjoy the fact of having focused and writing down and typing really elegant, beautiful code that is like a masterpiece, right? And I'm curious, I don't know, yeah, I'm curious your reaction to that. You'd be like, dude, like, what are you talking about? You're clearly not an engineer, but also, yeah, like, how is that going to change? And where are you going to find satisfaction?
I think it's probably changed throughout my career. Like when you're early on in your career, like you just want to ship a bunch of stuff, right? Because shipping a feature, having people use it is like a dopamine hit. So you're just this like dopamine addict, just shipping. You're like getting high off of shipping code, which also feels good that you're recognized for things like that. But it's still very much like just ship anything, get it working. I think that's also something you can think about for like early stage startups as well. I think as I've gotten further in my career, I start thinking about how can I produce more impact for the team? And that's in creating conventions, patterns, seeing things that others might not necessarily see that are like helping to unblock a team. And I think that's like a higher level of abstraction that then we need to be thinking about. And so that piece, I think, will always stay is like that level, like always thinking in abstractions and helping to like create value that way. When it comes to, sorry, what was the other part of the question?
What brings you joy, maybe?
Yeah. What do you
craft?
like? Yeah. What is the craft that you think you're just you enjoy, and is that you think you're going to be able to continue doing that or not for the upcoming years?
I think part of the craft too is like continuously learning. And so a good example is understanding how do you like write evals for an LLM, which especially if you're building like AI products, that becomes increasingly important. And it's this like continuous learning, compressing of roles as well, where like even we're seeing software engineers and MLEs like squishing together a little bit more, because a software engineer that understands how to use like an API call to OpenAI, now they have to be able to understand how to prompt it, have test data to be able to work with it, and then also write evals against it. So there's always like this continual learning that needs to be happening. And then on the other discussion around like the product design software roles compressing, like you have this huge amount of space for you to grow and think in, where you can help out being a little bit of a designer, because rather than maybe having to use Figma, you can just vibe code something internally using like your internal design system and say, hey, this is like a clickable prototype, and show that to product, show that to design. And so I think it's a little bit, at least for me, part of the continuous learning and working in a space like that MLE is working in that I haven't done before. That's like really exciting. And then also expanding my role in like product design, being able to level up those skills. And at the end of the day, always like being a builder and being able to accept that like you're just building a little bit differently. And So I'll liken it to the same colleague that I mentioned earlier, who was one of the co-founders of Pylon, Robert. I was talking to him about building a company and how it feels to build a company. And he said he loved it because he's no longer just like building things with code. Even though he has to build like HR systems and things like that, it's like this new creation. And the pieces going to that new creation are just different. And I think I was always very much a person. I was just like, if I were starting another company, like I just want to code. I just want, but he helped me like switch that lens to think of it as like you're always just building something, and the thing that you're using to build is different. And because we're going to be seeing like these roles compress so much more, I think engineers also have to start identifying like what areas are they maybe also interested in learning, what areas do they want to up level their skill set in, because like maybe product's a little more interesting, maybe design's a little more interesting, maybe infra is a little more interesting to them because AI allows you to be good enough to be dangerous in all these different facets. And I think this also goes into sort of what predictions are happening of having like single founder unicorn companies, where if you're able to do all of these things, even like slightly, now you don't need to hire a bunch of people to go do go to market or distribution, which I think go to market and distribution is still the piece that a lot of people are talking about that AI has yet to come for, because like you need to be really creative and strategic there. So I
Have
think
any of these areas, Nick, outside of engineering, been glittering to you as like places that you're finding yourself like more drawn to explore that are outside of the engineering swim lane? Now that there's more of this melding of roles.
I think probably on the like the machine learning side more than anything. I think I've always seen myself as like a product engineer. And so I think about there being two types of engineers, like a product engineer and like an engineering engineer. And engineering engineers are like into infrastructure and like the really clean code and like the beautiful monolith, like the perfect architecture, all those kinds of things. Like they strive for those things and they definitely have a place. I think I'm very much like on the product side of I'm using technology to produce value. And I need to know enough about the other stuff to be dangerous, but I lean more towards product. I lean more towards design. I think you probably remember this, Ben, from when we were working together. I was very much, oh, what if we did it this way? Or what if it looked like that? I always had lots of feedback and design reviews. And so I think I already naturally lean that way. And I look at working with LMs more closely, working on AI products as being like that next frontier of needing to build the skill set there so I can get either really good at it or be good enough to be dangerous. So it helps up level how I actually build products in like my day-to-day job and whatever I want to be doing.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I want to make sure we have time to get to the predictions too, because I think that's it's hard for people that are not, we can make predictions about where product management is heading. But I'm curious, are there any predictions, Nick, or areas where you have more than a coin toss worth of conviction that the engineering field is heading over the next few years that maybe people who are not engineers might not be thinking about?
I think we're going to see products that are vibe coded have huge security incidents. I think that's probably just like a given. Like there's gonna be one vibe code product that just like blows up that has like a huge security incident. Hopefully that doesn't happen for that product. I think we're going to see like a resurgence of engineers coming out and saying like, hey, actually like AI coding isn't as helpful as we think it is. And because the pendulum has swung so far to like getting rid of like, because we're in the hype cycle, people are starting to come back to that middle. And so I think, as I described before, this is starting to become more in the zeitgeist of like engineering and how engineers use AI. And I think probably the last one is, no, I think that's it actually.
Yeah.
I had one and it's gone. So it was really good.
That first one sounds like it's like 100% true. That's definitely going to happen. There's going to be someone that gets a shit ton of traction because they're really good with go-to-market and distribution with a vibe-coded product that has really bad security protocols associated with it, and there's going to be a breach and something really bad's going to happen. That's definitely I don't see how that's not going to happen.
I think it's already happened in some degrees. Like I think there was like a vibe coded like dating app that I think they released the users and their emails. It wasn't like on the millions of users, but I think they had thousands of users, and that's a little bit awkward. Let's say you maybe are dating someone and your name comes up in the app. It's not that you have like social security, but it's like kind of like the Ashley Madison deal when they leaked those names. So
Wasn't that the one that you had to like upload your driver's license to?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's actually kind of bad. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's so bad. But as far as like the pendulum, there's so much Kool-Aid, I think, being drunk by CEOs and VCs and just like people on the non-technical side of things about how much AI can just get stuff done. Are you feeling like you're expected to produce 10 times the amount of work that you used to, or like has it personally are you feeling like there's all these expectations of volume that you're noticing, or do you feel like in your world that's not happening?
I think it's still for engineering leaders that understand, and I think Entra has amazing engineering leaders. I think they understand that we're still very much in the early innings and we're learning. And that's all that like we can currently expect of what are the wins, what are the losses. And as these tools become more part of our day-to-day operations, I think expectations will start to come out in a lot of companies because they understand what engineers can and cannot produce using AI. And so at least for us, like it's a wait and see. And I think that's definitely the approach to be taking, but probably prediction like 2 to 3 years, like we're going to start seeing a lot of teams have expectations of shipping faster using AI. And then I think like we're going to hear a lot more about like cracked engineers and like how does one become like a cracked engineer using AI, and those that know how to use it I think are going to be like that much better.
Yeah. It sounds like kind of what I'm hearing of like where you guys are at is leadership has basically they're at a point where they're almost encouraging people to build an intuition around what to use these tools for. Build like what are these tools good at? What are they not? Where is the alpha, right? And maybe like a slight intuition of you should be maybe a little bit more productive, but there's not that pressure of, hey, like we expect everyone to be like 5x more productive. The hope is that maybe in a few years we'll get there, but for now it's more about, hey, let's definitely encourage and create a safe space for people to play with these tools because there's clearly going to be some alpha. The question to be had yet is like how much alpha and where is that alpha?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I had one thing I wanted a quick thought about, and then we'll wrap.
Sure.
I was talking to an engineer friend recently, and he said that the biggest thing he's noticed is that there's just like a dramatic increase in the number of PRs he has to review as like the most senior engineer on his team, because there's just so many more PRs being pushed by more junior engineers, and a lot of them are not good PRs, and he has to take all this like human time to provide human feedback from like the most senior engineer on the team on like basically like junior code that was generated with AI. I don't know if you have a reaction to that, Nick, but I had this moment where I was talking to him. I'm like, oh my God, is there like this wave of PRs full of AI slop that are like eating up engineering productivity and no one's talking about it?
I would think in some ways, yes. I definitely don't see that at Entra at all. I think a lot of engineers that we have aren't just kind of like push. I think for like startups that might be the case because like also hiring a junior engineer is probably a lot faster. You could probably pay them less potentially, so you can just have a lot more junior engineers. But I think when it comes to a situation like that, then that becomes, for lack of a better way of saying, probably like a performance conversation, like with a manager to be able to say, hey, you got to stop just pushing AI PRs. And I think that's how those things change, and even like company culture, engineering culture, to make sure like all your stuff is linted. And I think like linting conventions is like a whole topic that like we didn't get into that help to provide the right amount of guardrails so that if you are using a lot of AI tooling, now if you could produce something that was like 80% incorrect, if you have the right guardrails in place, now you're producing something that's 10% incorrect. Run your linting, run all your tests locally, do all this stuff before you even push a PR, because now like you don't need to review something that's just garbage coming out.
Totally. Cool. This was awesome. I know we're running out of time. So Nick, just like in closing, first of all, thanks for doing this. And
Thanks for
second,
having me. This is so much fun. This is fantastic.
no, this is, my brain is, I'm realizing there's so
Same.
much I don't know about the entire engineering. Like, it's almost like we've been over here on the side and the engineer's been over there, and we're like, we're just making all these assumptions about what engineers are thinking about.
Yeah.
And now I'm realizing like you shouldn't be making any of these assumptions.
But what's cool, there's definitely some parallels too, right? Like, I think that's what's really cool is like there's all these kind of assumptions that I've made that were completely wrong, but then there's some really cool parallels. Yeah, so I think that's encouraging to see.
Yeah. Nick, where can people, if they want to learn more about what you're thinking about, what you're up to, where can they go if you care to direct them somewhere? And is there any way the audience could potentially be helpful to you?
Yeah, so I recently got my green card, which means now I can actually work on side projects outside of my current day job. And so I am releasing a Zoom marketplace app that was actually inspired by one of the members of Supra. You can check it out at nextmeet.ing. So it's called Next Meeting. And we have that. And then at some point, I'm hoping to get a newsletter started on how to be a cracked engineer. But work, side project, being a dad, there's a lot of stuff that goes into things like that. So maybe just check me out on LinkedIn and see that come through, because that'll happen at some point, but not today.
Nice. Cannot wait to subscribe. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, we will link to all of the above in the show notes. All right, that's a wrap.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, man.